Please welcome everyone, Yafi.
Hi, everyone. Have you ever heard the phrase, it's just CSS? I don't like that phrase, but I'm also guilty of saying that phrase, so I'm not putting myself on a pedestal here. So why do I not like that phrase? The answer is that it's often a sign of underestimating CSS. And when I say that, I mean treating CSS like it's trivial and it doesn't require any technical thought to do well. When CSS gets dismissed, bad things happen. I've seen broken web apps. I've seen wildly wrong project timelines. I've seen messed up hiring pipelines. I've seen misevaluations of people's work. I've seen code bases so unmaintainable that every style change risked breaking the application. And I've seen all of these things result from ignoring the considerations that come with CSS. So my goal today is to spread one message. Don't underestimate CSS, please. Now that's out of the way, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Yafi, and I'm a senior software engineer at Squarespace, where we give people the tools to make pretty websites and do business online. Today, I'm going to talk about taking CSS seriously, which means treating it like the legit technical concern it is. There will be 3 phases. Part 1, why should we care about this topic? What impact does it have on you? Part 2, why does CSS get underestimated? And part 3, what can we do about it? My end goal is for you to walk away with practical strategies to avoid the problems that can come from treating CSS like it's nothing. Let's get started. Part 1, why should we care? I'm going to start with a story about what can go wrong when CSS gets underestimated. Years ago, I was working on a web application and I was asked to make a simple change to a component's styles. No problem. I got started. Spoiler alert, it was not a simple style change. As I dug into the styles, I started to realize that I was dealing with a mess. Some of this component's styles were both injected and overridden at unpredictable times through JavaScript. Some of the styles came from a complex build process. Some of the styles were inherited from a global system and then hacked around. Page elements that may or may not have been present at any given time all needed to know about each other. Elements were nested in unintuitive ways and then styled in ways that were even less intuitive. And any small style change triggered all sorts of combinations of cases that needed to be accounted for, many of which would break different parts of the system in different ways. Here's an illustration of how I felt trying to edit the styles. It's basically like this leaning tower of wooden blocks, and moving one of those blocks could bring the rest crashing down. So how did we get here? I decided to check the Git history of the component, and guess what I discovered? I discovered that 6 increasingly experienced engineers had tried to make the same style update and failed for a year. In every case, the result was the same. Try to change it legitimately, put in a hack that was close enough, find out later it was broken in a new way, and once everyone had forgotten about it, try again. In truth, make that small style change actually felt more like rewrite some of the browser's rendering logic from scratch. Seeing the situation, I put in my own temporary hack and then flagged this part of the system as something whose front end would need to be revisited with more time. I explained the problems to the stakeholders, like we couldn't add features, we couldn't fix bugs without creating new ones, etc. And then we were finally able to get it prioritized so we could fix it properly. So now let's recap. This project had been treated as something simple the entire time. It's just CSS, it's just styling, it's not a big deal. As a result, this part of the system was built with fragile architecture, and the estimates are way off. And the other engineers who originally tried to solve the problems with this part of the system were seen as being unable to complete something simple. So now let's talk about some of the other consequences of underestimating CSS. One consequence is weak scrutiny, weak code scrutiny. So what does that mean? Well, if you think CSS isn't a big deal, then you're more likely to do lax code reviews. I've seen this outlook of, it's just CSS, it'll be fine. And then it breaks. Or maybe you don't do enough testing or verification. Or maybe that just means not checking responsiveness or structure. Like for example, I've actually seen a major online store's buy buttons completely hidden on my laptop because viewport units were misused and not checked across screen dimensions. And I only found out about this because I thought something looked a little bit off and I inspected the page's source code. Otherwise, I wouldn't have seen it. Another thing that can go wrong when CSS gets underestimated is that you end up inadvertently giving far-reaching architectural decisions to someone who's new to the team or even new to the field. I've seen situations where people have said, it's just styling, give it to the new person. And then the code base was saddled with the results of that decision. And to be clear, I should add that I'm not trying to discourage giving people projects and decisions that stretch their abilities, because that's how people learn and grow. However, it should come from a place of deliberate intent rather than just discounting CSS. Another area that can go wrong when CSS gets trivialized is hiring. For example, years ago, I worked at a place where the front end interviews only assessed JavaScript, even though CSS was a crucial part of the day-to-day work. The reasoning for these scenarios typically goes along the lines of, well, JavaScript is the hard part. If they know that, then CSS is easy. And that is how you end up with a full team of front-end developers with limited CSS experience who in turn fail to evaluate CSS knowledge among new hires. And then the cycle continues, and then you end up with broken sites and apps. From talking to industry peers, this is not a unique experience. So now that we've seen what can go wrong when CSS gets trivialized, the next question is why? And that brings us to our next segment. Why does CSS get underestimated? All right, this slide. Okay, some people say CSS is not a programming language because it's a style sheet language which is responsible for expressing the presentation of a document. And then other people will say CSS technically is a programming language because there are ways to prove it's Turing complete, which roughly translates to it can calculate all the things and express all the algorithms. And to be clear, I'm drastically oversimplifying here, but it doesn't matter. For our purposes today, this whole debate is a distraction because either way, CSS is still a computer language. It still affects your systems. And most importantly, it still requires thought to use well. And too often I'll hear people say it's not a programming language, which is fine, but then they'll take it a step further and then use that to completely dismiss CSS. And then they'll go on to use CSS badly, and then their apps will break and their systems will suffer, and yet somehow they'll still go on saying it's just CSS. And that's what I'm trying to take aim at here. However you want to classify CSS, that's completely fine. But please just don't use that as a license to ignore it. Now that that's out of the way, the next reason why CSS can get underestimated is it's easy to get started. While CSS is difficult to master, when you're just getting started, it looks like this. Someone who has never seen CSS in their life can probably at least begin to guess what this code is trying to do. So let's read it. Page heading text, color green. Presumably, there's some heading text on our page, and we want to make it green. I think the code gives us a pretty decent idea of what it's trying to do. I can see how someone first looking at CSS could see this and other things like it and think, well, I don't have to think all that hard about this. However, CSS has a high skill ceiling and a lot can be done with it, like this CSS art, for example. This is a pure CSS illustration by an expert by the name of Diana Smith, and it's always inspiring to see stuff like this. It takes a lot of time, a lot of patience to get to this level. By contrast, for a lot of everyday use cases, a little CSS knowledge can go a long way. Once you know some of the basics of sizing, spacing, alignment, and coloring, you can do a lot. And because it's easy to start with, CSS lends itself to something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The idea here is that beginners are more confident because they're not sure what they don't know, and then experts are sometimes less confident because they realize how much they don't know. So if someone thinks that they already know everything that they need to know about CSS, you can see how they'd stay a permanent beginner without even realizing it. So what makes this problem worse is that good CSS and bad CSS can produce output that looks the same. As a result, it's possible to write bad CSS and think you've written good CSS. To illustrate the point, let's look at a couple of layouts. So look carefully. Which one of these layouts has the bad CSS? You can't tell just by looking. One of them could be great, and the other one could be terrible. One could be clean, maintainable, responsive, robust, and crucially, safe to change. The other could be plagued by risky dependencies, brittle selectors, layering problems, non-responsive dimensions, and unsafe code changes where the smallest update can cause breakages all over your site or application. With all that in mind, we can see how it's possible to be lured into writing the bad layout, looking at the visual output, and being like, yep, that's the good layout. Another reason CSS gets underestimated is that the easy problems and the hard problems can sound exactly the same. For example, let's take the phrase, adjust that spacing. From the description alone, we don't know whether this is a quick fix or a system level problem. Why is that? Well, it's because CSS can attack from anywhere at any time. CSS rules are global and they compete and overwrite each other. Styles can come from different places, such as elements, files, style tags, JavaScript, automated builds, third-party widgets, etc. Styles can also show up at different times, like on load or on click or on scroll or on hover or on a form interaction or on a timer, just to name a few. Styles can also apply for different conditions, like maybe when the screen gets wider or narrower or taller or shorter, or maybe for touch devices or keyboard navigation. There's also different priorities based on specificity, and there's layering depending on Z indices and stacking contexts. All of those things I listed can appear in different combinations. So if you multiply that out, there's a lot to account for. The point is that when you need to change a style, it can be hard to know what else is involved, and that's why something that sounds simple can actually require a system level change. Of course, this kind of situation comes with the inevitable phrase, can't you just? And the answer is typically no. You can't just do that thing. Not only is this suggestion not the solution, it may not even be addressing the right problem. And this type of conversation is a typical byproduct of treating CSS like it's trivial. So now we've talked about the reasons why CSS gets underestimated, but ultimately they boil down to one thing. CSS is hard to gauge. Hard problems look like easy problems, system level changes look like quick fixes, and good CSS can produce the same visual output as bad CSS. But there's good news. Now that we know why CSS gets underestimated, we can take steps to fix this. That brings us to part 3 of this talk, how to stop CSS from being underestimated. So there are 3 practical steps we can take to reduce how often CSS gets trivialized by us as well as the people around us. I'll cover them in detail, but first here's the quick overview. Step 1 is awareness. Step 2 is communication. And step 3 is assessment. What does any of this mean? Well, let's start with awareness. So when I say awareness, I mean being aware of the considerations involved in writing CSS. So let's talk about that. What is involved in writing CSS? Well, there's structure, dependencies, modularity, responsiveness, inheritance, clarity, constraints, accessibility, performance, layout, architecture, scope, frameworks, automation, testing, debugging, cross-browser compatibility, and more. I just threw a lot of words at you, but the overall gist is this. When you're writing CSS, you're dealing with systems. And because you're dealing with systems, you'll need to think about the considerations that come along with a system. For example, how do different pieces of the system affect each other? What happens under various conditions, both internal and external? How does the system respond to change? How do you handle testing? What are the performance implications of various decisions? Which frameworks and methodologies make sense for your use case? And so on. In addition to the systems considerations, CSS has considerations that don't necessarily apply to other systems. For example, there's responsiveness to different window sizes. There's UI accessibility. There's cross-browser compatibility. There's the global nature of CSS rules, which can complicate your code structure and dependencies. There's inheritance and specificity, which can cause one area of your system to have unexpected side effects on another if you're not careful. Then there's the trickiness of debugging. The thing about CSS is that the bugs aren't the types of things that would be caught with an error message. The CSS code that breaks your application is often technically correct. Also, it becomes important to understand the layout algorithm CSS uses to place content in a layout, or else you'll get tripped up by things like stacking contexts and how they handle layering. In any case, the main point is the more aware you are of what's involved in CSS, the less likely you are to underestimate it. What makes this even better is that you can multiply the benefits of this awareness through communication. So let's talk about communication. The main idea here is that we can help avoid the dangers of underestimating CSS by changing the conversation around CSS. So what do I mean by that? Well, the way we talk about CSS influences the way we approach CSS. So let's go over some strategies to communicate about CSS in a way that promotes a healthy understanding of its considerations. One strategy I like is to describe past projects and challenges that have involved CSS. Why? Well, remember how I said in CSS the easy problems and the hard problems can sound exactly the same? Well, that's before you start them. After you finish, it's a whole different story. Now that you've gone through the problem, you know exactly what's involved and you're in the best position to share it. And when I say share it, that could be in meetings or chats or documents or even presentations. And when you do this, you spread knowledge, which means you and the people around you will become better at solving CSS problems and better at estimating CSS projects in the future. And now that we're on the subject of spreading knowledge, I recommend sharing CSS tips that you read, hear, or find. Maybe you've read about a useful CSS technique in an article. Maybe a new feature is on its way to browsers. Maybe you saw something interesting in a code base or on a website. In any of those cases, by all means, share what you've learned. Might as well multiply the benefits, right? Another way to improve the conversation around CSS is to discuss technical architecture. If there's a new project or update, maybe sometimes it makes sense to discuss how it fits into the existing system. Do the requirements of the project expose potential improvements that could be made to how CSS is handled in your code base? Maybe there are constraints and trade-offs to consider. These types of conversations get people in the habit of thinking of CSS not as a series of one-off properties like spacing here or color there, but instead as part of a larger system that requires careful thought. Word choice is the next point I want to bring up because it makes a difference. It might seem like a small thing, but every time we describe a significant project or change as just CSS or not a big deal, we contribute to a culture where CSS gets underestimated. This kind of dismissive language also contributes to an environment where people don't want to ask questions or admit to challenges. And that's not a good situation to be in because then people aren't communicating or learning. Word choice becomes especially important in leadership or otherwise senior positions where a few words can have an outsized impact. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we treat every CSS update as a system level undertaking because, like any language, some things really are easy. All I'm saying is just to not automatically downplay something for the sole reason that it's CSS. So for the last part of this segment on communication, I want to talk about estimates. Now, I've already said CSS is really difficult to gauge, but there are steps we can take to make it a little bit easier. While it's difficult to know what's involved in a CSS project, we can start to see patterns if we know what to look for. The more we communicate and the more we become aware of what's involved in CSS, the more we start to recognize the categories of problems we might run into. For example, does this project have dependencies? If so, where do they come from? And how might they affect our work? Is the existing structure clean or messy? Are we attempting something that doesn't have wide browser support yet? Those are just a few sample questions, but that's the general idea. The more you bring up the categories of possible problems and considerations, the less likely you are to be caught completely off guard. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than nothing. So in our journey to prevent the underestimation of CSS, we are now on step 3, assessment. In other words, how do we evaluate CSS? First, there's code reviews. One thing I've seen is when a code change is all CSS, it doesn't always get as much scrutiny as other types of code changes. Oh, it's just CSS, it's not a big deal. And then there's a panicked rollback when things break. The fix here is to resist the temptation to basically ignore CSS in a code review. At least read through it and try to get an idea of what it's trying to do. If you're not sure about the impact of a change, that's normal. Ask questions, look at similar examples, and over time, you'll start to gather a mental model of the types of recurring patterns that can cause issues. And even if a particular CSS change doesn't seem like a big deal, CSS tends to be one of the first things your users will see, so it's good to get it right. The next thing I want to talk about is how we evaluate the CSS work of the people around us. When we underestimate CSS, we're in danger of accidentally belittling the work of others and of ourselves. The fix for this is to maintain the awareness and communication around CSS that we talked about earlier so that there's more understanding on what's involved in everyone's work. This could also help us to be better advocates for the people around us. If you see someone do something that maybe deserved more credit, let people know. So now let's talk about interviews. I have seen and heard about front-end interview loops where CSS is either barely assessed or ignored entirely. The fix is to give CSS a place in your interviewing process and make it reasonably proportional to how much it's used on the job. That way you'll create an atmosphere where CSS gets the consideration it needs. Now that we've covered the main points, let's quickly recap what we've gone over. First, we talked about the dangers of underestimating CSS. Next, we talked about the underlying reasons why CSS sometimes gets underestimated. Finally, and most importantly, we covered what we can do about it. Specifically, that means being aware of what's involved in CSS, changing how we communicate about it, and improving how we evaluate it. Before we go, I want to mention a caveat, and that is, don't overthink it. I know this whole talk has been about taking CSS seriously, which is important, but it's definitely possible to go too far. And when I say go too far, I mean things like over-engineering a solution, or starting arguments over nothing, or trying so hard for perfection that you can't move forward. So please avoid that stuff. When I say take CSS seriously, what I'm really saying is just don't underestimate it. CSS is a beautiful, powerful, complex, interesting language, and I'd love to see it treated that way. That means instead of saying it's just CSS, we recognize that CSS represents a whole living, breathing system. Instead of saying it looks fine on my screen, we try different dimensions so we know our layouts are unbreakable. Instead of tearing people down for the coding languages they happen to be good at, we lift each other up and celebrate each other's accomplishments. Instead of having simple changes fraught with fear, we can step forward confidently, knowing our CSS is robust. What I'm really saying is, I want to see a world where we give CSS the same consideration as any other system. In other words, please don't underestimate CSS. Thank you.